Hey, this is Jamey with Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about my favorite mechanism in Rabbit Island, a Kickstarter game that I recently played for the first time. Or at least I kickstarted it. Might be available in retail at this point. There are a few things that I wanted to mention about this game that I thought were really cool. One is a mechanism, one is a use of a component. I'll talk about the component first. One of the core things you're doing in Rabbit Island, and I'll talk about this with my mechanism in a second, is playing movement cards. So you're playing a movement card on your turn. They look like this, and it has you move a certain number of spaces. But the really cool thing that I discovered about this component from Joe when he taught this was that they're numbered. You can see these numbers down here. So that's number 11, this is number 38. And if you look at these cards in order, they tell the story of these rabbits that have discovered this island and are moving around it. So each piece of art kind of tells a piece of that story. I'm showing you the art out of order, but if you look at these numbers in order, they would tell the story of the rabbits arriving at this island and colonizing it. I think that's really clever. I don't think I've ever seen that in the game before. They could have just used the same art for every card that says move 2 spaces in this game, but instead they used a ton of art to tell a unique story through these cards. Yeah, so that I thought was really, really cool. My favorite mechanism in the game, though, is related to the movement, and movement is a huge part of the game. At the beginning of Rabbit Island, you create the board using tiles that look like this. They look like this. So they have these tiles that have arrows that point in certain directions, and they're these uniquely shaped tiles that fit together in certain ways and not in certain other ways. So the first part of the game is just putting together a big board of paths that fit together. And the paths matter because for the rest of the game, for most of the game, you are taking your rabbit and you are moving it along those paths based on one of those movement cards that I just showed you. And then doing something at the space where you end up. But at the end of each of these paths, and this happens at the end of the setup phase of the game, you put one of these rabbit holes. This is both thematically and mechanically really clever in my opinion, because the rabbit holes end the paths and they send you back to the home base. I forget what the home base is called, but there's a originating point or tile that you end up going back to. So throughout the game, you're kind of running along these rabbit paths, darting through these holes that are they're all the same at the end of the paths, and then starting over for a new loop and going perhaps in a very different direction. You could go the same direction, you could go in a completely different direction. And many of the paths split off into different directions, but they all end with a rabbit hole that sends you back to the original camp, or whatever that tile is that I'm forgetting the name of. I really, really like this mechanism. It adds a really interesting puzzle element to the game, because you always know you're going to end up going back to the home base, but you're kind of deciding how fast do I want to do that? Do I want to cycle around to these other spots? And it adds, there's something spatial about it that reminded me a little bit of games in outer space, where you have a bunch of tiles on the board that kind of make you want to explore outward. But in some of those games, there's not always a way to easily get back in, and you can even get trapped as you get back in if other players have controlled those territories. That isn't the case in Rabbit Island. You're not getting trapped. But I really like how in certain space games, you have like warp gates on the outside of the board, so that if you do explore out, you can jump into one of those warp gates and jump back to the middle of the board, or jump to a completely different part of the board. And that reminded me a lot of this mechanism in Rabbit Island, where no matter how far you go down a path, you're always going to be able to jump back to the beginning and start over again and perhaps take a different route. You're never trapped. And I never want players to feel trapped in games that I design. So I really like this mechanism in Rabbit Island. So if you have a different favorite mechanism in Rabbit Island, or you want to explore that mechanism further through examples in other games, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments of this Rabbit Island video. Thanks.